This is Permissionless Liberty.
Hello, everyone. This is Adam Knott, and I'm joined by Daniel Sanchez. Today, we're going to be discussing two articles that Daniel's written. One of them is entitled, Are We Living Under a Kakistocracy? A Government by the Worst. And the other is entitled, When Meddlers Run Amok. And these are two, as I think you'll see when we're talking through this, these two essays kind of touch on universal libertarian themes. One of them really focuses on what is an effective means to basically achieve or start to move towards a libertarian future, and the other discusses the situation that we're in. In other words, we're in a situation where government is increasing, and that's clearly stated in Dan's article. And so it's, again, we keep coming back to kind of universal themes. I think there's a lesson in that, but we'll kind of point that out as we go along. But Dan, why don't you go ahead and get us started with a discussion of one of your articles?
Sure. So these are both 2022 articles on fee.org. And the Kakistocracy one is based off of two articles by Leonard Reed, both titled Kakistocracy. One was in the Freeman magazine in 1963, and the other one is a chapter in his 1977 book, Awake for Freedom's Sake. And in that article, I talk about Leonard's discussion of that idea of a kakistocracy, of government by the worst. He cited the definition coined by James Russell Lowell of a kakistocracy as government for the benefit of knaves at the expense of fools. Or I should say at the cost of fools, is what he actually said. And so that's one problem that we're dealing with, is that we seem to have really bad people in charge, both in terms of, and it's kind of unclear how much of it is evil versus stupidity. But then there's the related problem of, what do knavish and foolish people do when they're in charge? And what they do is a lot of meddling and a lot of intervening in the free society, making it less free, intervening in the economy, intervening in our personal lives, just meddling. And so, what do we do about both problems? And one thing that Leonard Reed advised is as follows. He said, "Let us never refer to any individual as a knave or a fool. This is inferiority showing through in ourselves. Everyone errs, more or less. Hang labels only on notions which appear to be knavish or foolish." And I wanted to pause right there, Adam, and see if that quote resonated with you, because it seems like it would.
I was actually going to ask you what it meant to you, but sure, since you beat me to it, I will be glad to answer. That's the first in the article. That's the first sentence that I wrote here. Let us never refer to any individuals as a knave or a fool. And what that means to me is, well, I don't know if it means exactly the same to me as it meant to Reed. To me, what it means is that we're living in a time where our fellow human beings have many of them have chosen a different path from what we think is the proper path, let's say. But that path that they've chosen is legitimate in the sense that there's that using government to get the things that you want is universally accepted, and I think there's something in human nature which considers that just a normal considers it normal. So if somebody is doing something which to them seems quite natural and normal, and the whole world's doing it, and there's no moral, the only people who are complaining are a very small minority of people. Um, from their point of view, it seems that they're doing. Uh, I guess in centuries, we could go centuries in the future and say how all look back in retrospect and see where we made mistakes. But I see the choice to engage in collectivism versus the choice to engage in individualism as a fundamental human choice that we all have to make. So it's forced upon us by our nature. So if my fellow human beings choose collectivism, and there are many good reasons that they might do that, not the least of which is the fact that all of society's intellectual bodies support them, whether it's all the universities and all the world governments, etc. So if they've chosen collectivism, meanwhile I, as a minority, have chosen individualism, I don't think it's effective to start the argument with just leveling pejoratives at them. I think we just have to accept that there's two fundamental choices. And now, once everybody's made their choice, now we're left with, okay, now what can we do? What are the options, given the fact that my next door neighbors and my relatives and my everybody else in my town has chosen to go in one direction, and I'm sitting here with a few other people that chose to go in another direction. So to me, it means that it's not the most efficient. It's probably not going to get you where you want if we start by just calling people names and saying, all the names are good, evil. Um, uh, so that's what it means to me. I don't know if you have a different interpretation or Leonard Reed meant it differently.
Well, he did mean that, but he did say that it's good to label ideas as evil or dumb, even though it's not usually very, as you say, very effective to label people that. And I think that there are grounds for doing that. You can say, even if you avoid telling a person that, oh, well, for engaging in intervention for the sake of collectivism, that, that is foolish. You might even like sort of not want to do that, like not even call the idea or the practice as foolish. In addition to not calling the person foolish. And, that might make sense from the perspective of a Misesian value-free subjectivist, because, philosophy and economics, that they are really about means and not ends, that you can't really scientifically judge an end, like an ultimate end, as good or bad. And so what Mises always says that, for example, what economics is a science of means. And then, so like, for example, if your ends are, maximum employment, then the means of a minimum wage is really ineffective toward that end. So then you can say that, okay, well, given the ends of a lot of these people who are engaging in intervention, supporting intervention, and subscribing to collectivism, that, like Mises says, that people in general prefer, wealth to poverty and health to sickness, and you'll see that a lot of collectivists, they don't like the results of their own policy. They blame it on capitalism. They blame it on not doing their policy enough, so they're confused about cause and effect. But by their own dissatisfaction with the results of their policy, and knowing that it's their policy that caused those results, you can say that given their ultimate ends, that their means were foolish. So I think a word like foolish is actually, it's not just arbitrary.
hmm well, I agree. You probably might agree with me that one of the um, predicaments that we find ourselves in is that if the policies are not policies that we agree with and they have negative consequences, um, uh, I see the problem is that um, the losses are socialized in a sense. Um, I would be more agreeable to a situation in which the effects of bad policy only fell on the people who agreed with the policy. Or, in a sense, my complaint is not that the policy is implemented, which has bad effects in the abstract. My complaint is that I have to be subjected to the negative consequence of the policy. So I guess I view um, my libertarian quest as in this. We've all had experiences in life where we decided to go in a different direction than maybe some specific group was going in, and then when we said later, I'm glad I didn't do that because it turned out to be a mess. Some group did an activity, and they all got into trouble. Um, Applying that like to a libertarian circumstances, like a lot of libertarians want to be invested in gold because they think the financial system of the non-libertarian society will crash one day, let's say. So they have opted out of that system and decided to have a tangible asset. So therefore, in a sense, they're protected from what they think will be the effects of the bad policies. Um, of course, it's going to affect them if it's their town or their village or their state. But I guess I'm distinguishing between when if I try to call somebody a bad name to try to get them to change, because I don't like what they're doing just in general, or I'm trying to call them a name because what they're doing to me. I guess I distinguish between those two things. So, but I guess I've always had now I think as humans, we're emotional creatures. So we eventually get angry and then we attach words to things. But I've always kind of had the little maxim that when the name calling starts, kind of the learning stops. So we use those words when there's no longer any dialogue or learning, and we've got to the end of our intellectual pursuit, and now we can start hurling, pejoratives towards people. And I try to avoid it as much as possible. Um, I think we're better served if we try to figure out the predicament we're in. What's the best path forward?
Yeah, and I think that it is just much more effective to attack the ideas instead of the individuals holding the ideas, instead of like an ad hominem attack. And I'm reminded of a passage from the Bible in verse 6:12 from Ephesians, where it says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So what that Bible verse says to me is just like, it's not flesh and blood. It's not really like the sinners that are the problem. It's the sin, like the famous phrase of hate the sin, love the sinner, often associated with Gandhi, but it goes back to St. Augustine. Um, and that's the problem is like the system of thought. It's like this, the institutions, the system, the principles, the bad ideas. And, that's what you really need to attack.
Well, yeah, a great. And looking forward a little bit about what we're talking about today. We could say, well, not really against any particular individual. In other words, I don't really have a beef with my fellow citizens, but I do object to the idea of trying to take things from me by force. So in other words, I just object to that idea. Now, if somebody wants to implement that idea and as a person wants to do that to me, then I could leave it to the other person to attach a person to that bad idea or that I consider harmful to myself. And as when we talk a little bit more, I think that's one of the defining complaints or one of the defining acts that libertarians object to. And they all say it in different words, because you've heard of the aggression principle. Or when I was getting ready to do our discussion today, Leonard Reed mentioned force. And I know Ayn Rand uses the word force. In other words, that's central to libertarian.
Especially the initiation of force.
Yes, yes. And so the main gripe or the main complaint is that I'm doing my life. I'm being peaceful. I'm producing some things, but there's another philosophy that says, well, we need to accomplish some things that we want to accomplish. We want to build a bridge. We want to have a defense. We want to have a court system, whatever. And they come to me and we don't agree contractually, but I'm forced. And I use the word coercion in my writing, but it's all trying to different ways of saying the same thing. So the idea that we libertarians, I would say, in the political sense, are mainly object to is the use of force or the initiation of force by which society tries to achieve its goals. Force used against basically non-criminal or people who are peaceful, who haven't done anything wrong, just as a political principle to approach them and say, listen, you've been making $100. We need 25 of them, 35, 45 of them, because we have a project. And if you don't give that to us, we have a list of punishments that we have to go through. You'll be fined if you don't, or you'll be delicensed, or you'll be apprehended. Or if you don't do any of those things, then of course, bodily harm is the next one on the list. So again, getting back to the idea that when I'm in society, it's not, I don't have a problem with my fellow human beings. None of them are coming at me with force anyway. They're laundering it through the government, who is then doing it kind of a third party. They're laundering the force through a third party. So it's the idea of coercive expropriation that I'm opposed to, and my fellow citizens. I mean, I'm really don't have a beef with them as individuals.
Yeah, and this can be hard for libertarians because, especially from a libertarian point of view, we really are living under a kakistocracy. That the worst, like the F.A. Hayek has a chapter in Road to Serfdom called "Why the Worst Get on Top," and the worst have got on top in a lot of ways. Like I always thought it was just so remarkable how Anthony Fauci, who was lionized as the greatest hero of the COVID crisis, how it turned out that he was like the greatest villain, that like he played a role in actually creating the crisis. And you and then with like a more recent thing of just the Epstein files that were supposed to be released last on Friday, but is mostly redacted what was actually released. And just the frustration of a lot of like former Trump supporters of that a big thing that they campaigned on, and a big thing that the kind of cause that the Attorney General Pam Bondi and the director of the FBI Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, who just quit the FBI, before they came into power, they were associated with transparency and draining the swamp and exposing these elites that are ruling over us, and talk about like rule by the worst. Like, it doesn't get much worse. It doesn't get any worse than the kinds of things that the people in the Epstein files are probably did, like, and so it's just this notion that, like, that's how corrupt our system is, that, the perpetrators of just the most horrific crimes imaginable are the elites in our society, that they're the elites in politics and in business and in entertainment. And so, yeah, go ahead.
We've touched on this before, but I think, and I think what I don't know what our fellow libertarians believe, but I see all that as just the unintended consequences of the massive increase in government that's been proceeding for the last 5+ decades. That I think that we probably don't realize that we expected the government to, if government increases decade by decade, we just think it'll have these effects like declining living standards, or regulations that prevent me from running my business, or things like that, and don't realize that as it increases, that the corruption that what we're calling corruption is just part of that increase. In other words, you can't separate the two. So if I remember the tales of the old Soviet Union, where it was just rampant, corruption. So it's basically the flip side of just the fact that, whereas before we had 30 or 40% government control, now we have 60 or 70%. And so now we're seeing all these things happen that come with that. But I wanted to touch on Fauci, which is so funny that, I agree with the sentiment you're expressing. So my understanding of what happened was, without calling names, just as I see it as a factual matter, was that he found a way, or his agency found a way to circumvent the restrictions, the regulations on gain of function research. They farmed it out to a lower biosafety level lab in China, and that was done on purpose. In the emails, his associates planned to get the grant that they got, and without saying exactly what lab it would be done in, and only sent the money to the Chinese lab after they had got the grant, the lower biosafety level. Then when the pandemic was coming across, and Fauci realized that it could have been due to his the research that he was supporting, gain of function research, and had actually been at a lower biosafety level. He convened a secret meeting to ask his underlings to write a paper denying that it could have been a lab leak. He used burner phones, and to this day, nobody has been forced to testify about that secret meeting. There were 5, 6, 7, 8 people, and I know that if you and I had conspired that way, we would be in jail a long time ago. I don't have to say. We can describe all this just very factually. You and I would be in jail if we had been part of that meeting, 8 to 12 people, and used those burner phones, and then concocted a story to cover up the lab leak. There's no way we'd be sitting here, having a nice conversation. So, and then when the pandemic's coming across, he advocated all the lockdowns that you mentioned in one of your articles. So it was just one thing after the other. It was just, but I thought what was amusing about the whole thing is that the whole trail, and then the other thing was the FOIA evasion. So his associate, David Morins, I believe it was, wrote how he was taught by the quote unquote FOIA lady how to avoid the FOIA requests. So because they do an email, they do a search for keywords. If you do a FOIA request, I say, I want to see everything that happened on, Wuhan, let's say. So you can misspell Wuhan, go WOOHUUN, and then it won't show up in the FOIA search. And so the woman in the FOIA department was coaching Fauci's lieutenant how to avoid his his correspondence coming up in the FOIA request. Not to mention, he also admitted in writing that he would that he and Fauci would use a Gmail account. He also admitted that he would go to Fauci's house to not have to put things in writing. So it was just basically legal evasion after legal evasion. And what was kind of amusing is that, as I said last time we talked, they're basically objecting to being overregulated because there's regulations on all these things. There's laws existing on all these things, and they're basically saying, "Man, this environment we're in, it's just I can't move. I can't do anything. I can't do research in China. I have to tell everybody about my meetings. People have to see my email. I mean, we're just overregulated here." And so they're step by step just trying to find ways to evade the regulations. It never dawns on them that libertarians have been saying, "Well, guys, we're piling regulation upon regulation. Do you think we might want to rethink this?" No, I'm just going to keep piling up the regulations. Then when they're inconvenient to me, I'm just going to evade them.
Yeah. So, with being a libertarian and seeing like the kinds of evasions and the kinds of backroom dealings that you're talking about with Fauci and what's going on with the Epstein files and everything. It seems like you should be able to call a tyrant a tyrant. You should be able to call an abuser an abuser, and you should be able to call someone who created or helped lead to a pandemic and helped lead to like a really bad response to that pandemic that only compounded the harm, as like a moral monster. And I think I know what Leonard Reed is getting at when he counsels against calling knaves is that, like you said, that's where the conversation starts. Stops. That you're not going to convince anyone of anything by calling them names. And so I wonder if it's just a matter of different purposes, like different objectives, whether it makes sense to call a knave. Because like if for example, like if you had some sort of relationship with Fauci, if you were like his brother-in-law or something, and you were actually trying to get him to repent, like it probably wouldn't be very effective calling him a monster, but if you're trying to make a point about like the system, for example, that this system actually like empowers monsters, like that you, like you said, like big government engenders corruption because power corrupts, as Lord Acton said, then it might be worth saying, because someone might agree that Fauci is a monster, but not realize that it's big government that is what put him in power. What do you think of that?
I guess I keep thinking about why I feel at peace with all the wrongdoing, in a sense. I mean, I'm angry as others are as well, but why I don't know if the word is stoic or rational about it, because libertarians, I think we agree, would agree that it's in traditional libertarian ethics, it's immoral to get a gang of friends and decide you want to do a project, and then go over the hill to the next town and tell these people they need to pay for it. And you're by coincidence, you all have guns, and you basically force them to pay for your project. So libertarians are in agreement that that's the immoral root of the problem. So as I see it, once that has already been done, in other words, once that's already established that my things can be appropriated by force from me, by threat of coercion, let's say, then I already see that there's a certain thing that's set in motion, because the next step after that is, well, I say, well, okay, you took my stuff, but please spend the money at least close to how I would like to spend it myself. In other words, the reason you took it from me is because you could see that I was going to spend it for my priority, and that was not acceptable. So you took it from me for your priority. So I guess to kind of justify that, then you say to me, well, Adam, don't worry, because we'll spend it for something good. We're going to build a bridge. You live in this town, don't you? Yeah, I live in this town. We're going to build a bridge. Okay, well, I guess that's better than just, okay, so that's better. But then the next step from that is, well, we didn't, we since we have this flow coming, we finished the bridge, but now we're going to use it for X thing. And that X thing is now further removed from the bridge. So now you're getting further away from what I wanted to spend my money on while still taking my money. But the next thing would be to actually spend it on something that I'd be really against. That'd be taking another step. The next step would be to actually take my money and then actually use it to come after me. That would be another step. And then the next step after that would be to take my money and come after me and lie to me and the public about it. That would be even worse. So once you already accomplished the original thing that I objected to, and all I had was to just beg you to please spend it closer to my value system, and you kind of at first said, yeah, I'll do that, and we both knew you weren't going to do that. So now you spend it for whatever. Basically, you're spending it for whatever you want. And I think it was the point. What people are frustrated about is that in the United States, I think the people, our government wasn't even, in their own minds, weren't even pretending to spend the money for what they are writing on paper they're spending it for. In other words, I think they're just using it as a welfare program for all the people surrounding the program. In other words, the ostensible purpose of the requisition of the money, let's call it a requisition of the money, it's just kind of a title that has to be filled in for formality, but that the money was just being used as a welfare program, which is totally in line, in my opinion, with leftist ideology. In other words, it's not evil from their point of view in Minnesota to take the money that was supposed to go for, let's say, autism for your child, and instead use it for welfare, because in their mind, using it for welfare is good. So, but what I think the problem was is that they sold it maybe to the public that they were going to use it for autism. The public says, okay, well, I was going to spend it on my own priorities, but you took it. So you said you're going to spend it on autism. I mean, that sounds worthy. It sounds like a good thing, because I know some people who have autism, or my friends' kids have it or whatever. And then, but the people who took it really, they're winking at themselves. They're kind of laughing and saying, and just take it and just spreading it out, because for them, it's a moral virtue. Playing Robin Hood is a moral virtue for them. So, and I'm at peace with that. I'm not trying to change that. I take that as the given. In other words, I think that, to me, there's a certain that's what once you were able to succeed in non-voluntarily separating me from my earnings, let's say, good for you if that's your philosophy and you're able to accomplish that. And we both know that I could ask you to please spend it wisely, or please spend it close to kind of what I want, but the main principle's already been breached or broached, whatever the word would be. And so therefore I'm kind of at peace with the fact that the full range of options that they have once they take it from me are on the table and may be used. because for sure they've been using them to come after me or people like me with that money. I mean, they wouldn't be able to do it. In other words, the government wouldn't be able to come after its own citizens if they didn't first get the money from the citizens. So that worst case scenario is coming true, and they are lying about it. So um, uh, I see that. So therefore, that is our challenge as libertarians. I'm not at the end of my wits with, so that I don't feel I'm at the end of my range of possibilities. So therefore, I think the learning can still happen, and my strategy and my options for action aren't over. So I don't feel the need. I don't feel at the end of my rope where I'm in the jail cell and they're about to, stick a needle in me. Then I can say, now I can say the last word can be, "You sons of bitches," I hate you. I could say that,
but again, they don't really like the consequences of what they're doing. So just to say like, well, good for you. Well, it's not really good for them because I mean, some people have a certain degree of moral vanity where that playing Robin Hood is the only thing that they care about, and not whether that doing so actually helps the poor people that they want to help in reality. Like a very, very few people are just like so morally vain that they don't really care about the poor people, that they just want to preen around as holier than thou. But a lot of people, it suits their morality because they think it'll help the poor people. And if you can show them that it systematically doesn't, and that it systematically makes that whole approach to the legal order systematically makes everyone poorer and more at odds with each other, more in conflict with each other, then their morality will change. So their morality isn't a fixed thing. Like it can be a variable that can change if they come to understand certain things.
well, I think that that is a fair statement of the, I would guess, analytical libertarian philosophy, that you could show somebody how their stated aims aren't being reached, and therefore that would imply that the policy enacted shouldn't be tried again because it was ineffective. But I feel that it's probably long past the time where we've realized that if showing that the original intent didn't work, that the person involved refuses to adjust the policy or to retract the policy or to cease from doing it in the future, that there's probably a deeper reason that's probably unspoken why they want to continue. And I think that's for sure the case. For example, I think it's it's human nature that if everybody was free, if we had a free society, there'd be some people who would really succeed and they would, quote unquote, leave us behind. So they'd be free to just pursue their goal into the future and just march right out of our lives. We'd have no control over them and couldn't control any part of their produce for what we consider to be very serious needs that we're afraid we won't be able to solve, won't be able to fulfill ourselves. Speaking from their point of view. So, in other words, we've heard of the term don't say the quiet part out loud. And I think the not saying the quiet part in terms of non-libertarian society is that by harnessing the produce of high achievers, they ensure that any progress of the achievers will with certainty down to them by force of law, not by not by just the spring, not by trickle down economics, as they would call it, and not by charity, but by law. So what they're interested in is a system. Non-libertarian society wants a system where you will be, in a sense, free to try to achieve, but it will be, the legal structure will be set up such that if you try to separate yourself from society, from the collective through achievement, we already have an automatic system where your produce has to be returned. A big part of your produce has to be returned back to the collective. So, and it's, so that's that. If that's fundamental, it doesn't really matter any policy that's enacted. It's independent of the success or failure of any policy. It's a means of harnessing your fellow citizens, knowing that some are more able and some are less able. And if we had a quote unquote free society, in other words, if all 350 million Americans were free economically and not burdened by regulations, there'd be no force of law that returned the produce of the high achievers, whoever they may be, to the people who might need important goods and services. We know what those are. They're
there'd
medical.
There'd be no force of law, but it would still be more likely that that those people would receive those things.
That gets us back to the discussion we had, where the libertarian promises to society that if we're free, our productivity will be 10 times greater. Okay. So if you let us free, we're going to have 10 times the greater productivity. So let that roll for 5 years. And now everybody who walks out of their house is going to have cheaper goods and more of them. So let's just agree amongst ourselves that that's true. But the non-libertarian doesn't care about that in general, especially in the more radical ones, because they've already stated that they'd rather have everybody be equal and poor than have a society where there's free people who are rich and have the poor people even have more than they would in a totally equal society. In other words, they're sincere about that. They're not just suing. It's not just verbal. It's not just verbal jousting.
But I think that's an ideologically possessed fringe, where they're so ideologically wedded to egalitarianism, and they're so like motivated by resentment against rich people and successful people that they would make that deal, they would make that trade. I think most people are not like that. Even most interventionists and collectivists today. But I mean, to your point that you raised earlier, that I think there are some people, especially those types of ideologically possessed people, collectivists and egalitarians, where they actually want such antisocial ends because of psychological hangups. It's not that they don't understand, the economics involved, or they don't, but that's not the main problem. And so I actually touched on this in my Meddlers Run Amok article, where I wrote, but advancing a pro-liberty and anti-meddling social, economic, and political philosophy is only half the solution. As Mises explained in The Psychological Roots of Anti-Liberalism, a section of his book Liberalism in the Classical Tradition, many people have moral failings and psychological issues that make their support for interventionist and socialist doctrines immune from rational counter-arguments. Some people embrace interventionism and socialism as a coping mechanism. They respond to disappointment over their own lives by shifting most of the blame away from themselves and out onto outside factors like greedy capitalists or capitalism itself. Through political activism, they meddle in the affairs of others as a way of evading responsibility for their own lives. As Leonard Reed put it, those who refuse to rule themselves are usually bent on ruling others, those who can rule themselves usually have no interest in ruling others. With people for whom meddling is less an intellectual error and more of an emotional hangup, a different approach may be needed. You may need to help them understand that a life philosophy of resentment is debilitating and self destructive, while a life philosophy of responsibility is fulfilling, ennobling, and can be downright life saving. Frederick Bastiat said to the mass meddlers of 19th century France, "You who wish to reform everything, why don't you reform yourselves? That task would be sufficient enough." And then I compare that to Jordan Peterson's whole "clean your room" um, mantra that was really popular with young people, of where he makes the point that um, these 18-year-old socialists who can't even keep their own room clean, think that they're going to clean up the world by, like, you know masterminding the economy. um, just that message, that a lot of times, ultimately, that's the root problem, is that they need to grow up, and they need people to help them grow up and abandon this sort of life philosophy of resentment, and then and doing so for their own sake, I think, is a lot easier. It's like, if a leftist is, like, virtue signaling about you know equality and the greater good, um and against selfish rich people, and things like that, and that virtue signaling is providing a lot of emotional value. Like I said earlier, that they're going to be immune to any kind of, no matter how good the argument that you make and how clear it is, they're just going to be completely immune, because they want to preserve that emotional value. But if instead you offer them a replacement emotional value of pointing out to them that, like, have you noticed that all this virtue signaling, that it never really fulfills you, and that you're constantly chasing that moral high, but that you're anxious all the time and depressed all the time, and like okay, well, you know here's this other way of looking at the world, and this other way of approaching your life that would actually make you not depressed and not anxious. And then they have real skin in the game, because then it's not just like an intellectual abstract jousting about this big picture. It's like a real question of, like, okay, how am I going to be able to sleep better at night? Like, how am I going to be able to function better throughout the day without crippling anxiety? Then they have a lot more incentive um, to accept what you're trying to tell them. And then once they accept that, and once they abandon their life philosophy of resentment, then what's been propping up their resentment-based socialism will be gone, and then the socialist arguments can be actually vulnerable to socioeconomic argument.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. How would you categorize that argument that you've just made? It's like it's an argument about that if people improved morally or spiritually, that they would then, in your opinion, or the opinion of whoever's expressing this, would be more likely to, more open to a free society in which government would not be used to um, as a coercive force for obtaining goods, which is kind of what's going on. In other words, it's this. There's obviously people have psychological a psychological side or a spiritual side. And what you're implying is that if they are more improved in that aspect, that would be linked to their being more apt to favor a free society. What do you have like a name for that? That because I don't think that's universally. I mean, I don't believe that, or I don't subscribe to that philosophy. Let's say. So how would you categorize or describe that outlook?
You mean the outlook that I want to cure leftists of, or the outlook
No,
of
the proposition or the suggestion that if somebody could be enlightened and feel better about internally, they'd feel morally better, or they'd have less anguish in their mind, less depression, so forth. Because I think that's what you were referring to. That could somehow.
Well, no, it's
okay.
it's not the lack of depression and anxiety that makes them more open to libertarianism. It's the philosophy of resentment that's creating that anxiety and depression. That it's that life philosophy going away that makes it more likely for them to accept libertarian political philosophy.
Okay, so
it's not just feeling better in general.
Okay.
It's that mental sickness that is causing both socialism and their anxiety. I mean, their belief in socialism and their anxiety.
Did you say mental sickness?
Yeah, so to speak.
Meaning primarily, let's say, resentment.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
So in other words, I mean, so the proposition, then could I say a person who's less resentful of his fellow citizens would be more apt to favor a free society? In other words, that's what we're saying then, or?
Yeah, and it's not just resentment, because earlier I mentioned, in addition to resentment, like insecurity. What Mises was talking about in terms of like wanting to evading responsibility and like coping with shame over their own failings in life. It's like the coping mechanism of being able to externalize the blame for their own failings to capitalism or what have you. So there's that. Leonard Reed has a great quote where he says that if everyone were devoted to the perfection of self, there could be no meddlers amongst us, and without meddlers, there could be no socialism. And so just that sort of that meddlesome life philosophy in general, that meddlesome mindset of that, like, oh, well, my, this notion that like the way you validate yourself as a good person is by meddling in other people's lives, and sort of this life philosophy against self-responsibility and self-improvement. So it's a whole complex of virtues and their opposite vices, that there are certain virtues that lend themselves to finding libertarianism and capitalism as amenable, and certain vices that will tend to lead people towards socialism and interventionism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just like with everything, there's a kernel. There's always truth to a philosophy or a theory. There's always some truth to it. But I guess I have not approached it. I wonder if we if we did assume that everybody was moral, or did not exhibit character flaws, or their character flaws were minimized or eliminated, if that would constitute for something that we could call then being a libertarian. In other words, if we eliminate whatever, let's say the top 10 character flaws from people, just do a thought experiment. Now, does that eliminate their ability to be a non-libertarian? And I don't know. I have never thought of that. I never thought, because I never approached it from the idea that I could put out a list of character flaws, but it can't be coercion or force, because that's kind of I think of more of an action. So, we say, okay, if I don't resent someone, and if I don't have envy, and if I don't have, let's say, even dishonesty, and you go down the list and you eliminate those from my personality, then am I left with something I would call a libertarian, or am I just left with somebody called a good person who still has to decide whether I should let people roam free and walk past a poor person when they're a billionaire, or should I try to make the law have to pay him 1% of his earnings, which will later turn into 2%, and will later turn into 3%, and will later turn into where we are right now, on the road to communism. I had been operating under the assumption that while I do believe that leftism does have a quality where the people tend to be non-transparent, I'm going to use that phrase as a non-inflammatory term for dishonesty, basically, but non-transparent in the way that they know kind of what they're doing isn't going to be liked, so they don't want to say what they think actually is going to happen. I had been operating under the assumption that, knowing the leftists that I have known, or non-libertarians, that they are overall moral people, that they didn't necessarily have to be envious and resentful and non-transparent, that you could actually honestly admit that, no, I'm happy, but I just don't think it's fair, because in my morals, it's not fair for somebody to be really successful and have no regard for their fellow citizens. And I'm not going to, on my watch, I'm not going to allow that to happen. I'm just not going to allow that to happen. And I will do everything I can in my power, in my honest power, with non-resentment and non-envy, to make sure that that person over there who's doing really well, he has to give back to society, because society helped him get where he is. And that's going to be part of the law. And I don't care what you call me, and I'm going to do that. So I thought that morality, whatever I just said, whatever that expresses, that a person could, and I'm taking people on the left, higher intellectuals, as saying something like that. So every name we bring up is going to have controversy, but Larry Summers has had some recent controversy, but he's an example of an intelligent leftist who, I'm sure he has his own personal failings, as we all do, but he would be somebody that when I'm thinking of an exemplary of, consider themselves moral. Is he resentful? Is he envious? I mean, he's very accomplished. Is he transparent? I mean, I've heard him say some very honest things about social. I think he's gotten fired for being honest about certain social issues. So his morality is that there's a collective of people, and we're all collectively responsible for each other. And that's the leftist starting point for social theorizing. It's always the collective. That's their starting point. It's a fundamental choice that we all have to make, whether we assert ourselves against the collective, or whether we think the collective is supreme and we need to subdue ourselves to the collective. If I get into discussion with everybody, I know how to direct the conversation, so that person's going to have to make that choice if they haven't already made it. But the people I listen to, they always when you listen to them talk, they always know that they started with a collective concept and they think it's totally justified. You couldn't even be born without a collective, they will say something like that, which has some truth to it. So therefore, so what happens is that then socialism is downstream of their fundamental choice to elevate the collective as opposed to the individual. And I don't know if that entails having to have bad spiritual or moral qualities.
It doesn't.
Okay.
Remember at the beginning of what I read, I said that correcting intellectual error is only half the solution. So I'm not saying that the other half of the solution of correcting character failings is the whole solution either. Like for some people that's a factor, for some people it's not. Maybe for Larry Summers it's not a factor, but for people like Karl Marx and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and any number of current sort of like leftists on antidepressants, like it probably is a factor.
Okay. Yeah. I just trying to grasp, the relationship between characteristics of our personalities and whether if people improved morally to some standard that we set
Yeah, it's not
abstractly,
it's
we
not
can't.
gonna automatically make them a libertarian.
Right. So
I
if
never
that's
said that.
okay. So you were in agreement that if we had a blind scale of justice and we put down our spiritual characteristics that a good person should have, they still in good faith could choose to have a society that harnesses, quote unquote, the high achievers for social aims. And that would be the beginning of socialism from which everything proceeds. Because once you do that for one thing, then you can do it once you do it to make a bridge or a homeless shelter, then you of course can do it for all the rest of the list. And then you get from 1% to 2% to 5% to 10%. And now we're up at 80%. So based on a choice that could by our own standards be a moral choice, indicating that the world of government that we're now drowning in could be built on a foundation, even though everybody, once they get into that system, they start trading our dollars around or whatever and wasting them. The edifice they built off of this one premise that it's moral to harness your fellow citizens' labor, they built a whole structure on that, while still being able to claim that they're moral individuals. And that's what I just said, I think, is the left's point. We're going to build a superstructure of legislation based on a moral foundation of making sure that on our watch, the high achievers won't be able to just run free, so to speak, without any regulation. And we're going to harness them. And we're all good people. We have the moral qualities, because I think if I'm not mistaken, a lot of leftists go to church as well, and are and profess allegiance to a certain set of values and moral qualities. So I guess I'm just trying to, elaborate that what we're up against is that the people who are preventing us from being who we want to be are very assured that they're actually more moral than we are, due to their outlook, which is towards the disadvantaged. And so,
Yeah, they're very assured,
mhm.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's that they can't that they're not that they can't be corrected in some sense. Because a recent article I wrote is called "Liberty is Natural, Practical, and Divine." And so in that article, I kind of update what my sort of moral foundation, my meta ethics have become. Because I've always been like Mises's type of utilitarian, but at the same time, I've never really balked at understanding certain things as evil and good. Uh, and I'm a Christian, and so the way I see that is that humans have a nature that um, that we're acting beings, um, and the human condition includes scarcity. So we're acting beings in a realm of scarcity, and there are certain tendencies and dispositions that humans have, and certain logically necessary truths about human action and human interaction that some of which are can be found in the laws of economics. Um, so that's all part of our nature and the nature of the world. And given that, and given our ends, given what humans tend to seek in terms of like life and health and prosperity and thriving, and that certain actions and certain rules, certain norms are, given that nature, are conducive to our ends. And so that's why, to me, something like the non-aggression principle is but is both natural and utilitarian. In that, given our nature, it serves our ends. It serves the ends that we seek. I disagree with like Rothbardians in the sense that like it's completely irrespective of individual ends. So, for example, if there was like some psychotic person, like sociopathic person who doesn't really care about their own life and flourishing and health, and that they're literally like masochists and just like to see pain, for them it's rational to pursue socialism, for example. But and in certain like lifeboat situations, it might not be true that the non-aggression principle will serve the ends of everyone involved. But by and large, in almost every single situation and with almost every single individual, following the non-aggression principle and also following certain like rules of conduct are make sense from a utilitarian perspective and suit our nature. So like they're natural and they're effective. They're practical. And I believe that the author of our nature is God. And I believe that the author of the laws of reality is God. And so I think that like in the and so so following the non-aggression principle, including thou shalt not murder and thou shalt not steal, and is is consistent with the author of our nature, and thus is consistent with that nature itself, and is consistent with our individual ends. So like I see all three things as kind of like parts of the same thing. And so like, the person that you're talking about, like the well-intended socialist, I think that they are acting against their own ends almost 100% of the time. Like, yes, there are some people who may have like hang-ups and may not care about the overall prosperity, and all that they care about is they just want to watch the world burn as long as the rich people burn first. So there are some people like that, but they're also miserable. And so like if they understood what's making them miserable, and to the extent that they actually care about poor people, what's actually good for poor people, then they would understand that the means that they're choosing are ineffective towards their ends because of their nature and because of the nature of things, and because of the author of that nature, meaning God. And so I think that even like the well-intentioned person, you can't just say, well, they're moral from their own perspective. It's like, yes, but that perspective is wrong. It's like if they understood the nature of economics, the nature of humans, the nature of how people work to get together, then they would change their mind about what moral is. They would realize that what they're advocating is fundamentally antisocial. And ultimately, I think that what people consider moral is what they consider as pro-social, both in terms of policies, but also in terms of character traits. That like the reason why, like, thou shalt not envy, like not being envious is a good thing. Like some people say like, oh well, I actually think envy is a good thing, but they if they understood how antisocial it is and how that corrodes society and causes more suffering, then they would be opposed to it. Then they would be morally opposed to it, and they would realize that the author of our nature, that when he said thou shalt not envy, it's not just a commandment written on a stone tablet. It's a commandment written on our very nature because of what envy does to societies.
Well, I guess a truism would be if everybody were more moral, we'd have a more moral society. So that's Ayn Rand's famous A is A, but that doesn't get us very far, right? I think then the question is the argument then shifts to what is moral. And then I think for me, we're back to square one, because is it moral to have a society that allows Adam to be free and have no financial responsibility or legal responsibility to his fellow citizens? Is that moral to let him be free and do that? Or is it moral to make sure that he can't do that, and that if he goes out and makes a living, he has to give back to society? And what I've learned in my decades of arguing, at first as a young person, actually arguing in living rooms till late into the night with the opposing side, our political adversaries, when I was in college. I was already on the libertarian side, or Ayn Rand side of the aisle, or whatever, the Mises side of the aisle. And my friend was already on the socialist side of the aisle. He's a good person. I knew him to be a very good person. He's very smart, much smarter than I was, much more learned. And I saw immediately. Well, I'll never forget that every argument I gave, he gave a counter, and vice versa. And I don't know if you had that before, where the arguments, Mises used to call it interminable. It just and the arguments I see today in society are the same. Everybody advances a plausibly good argument, and then the other side is able to meet that with a plausibly good argument. So the argument whether the individual should be free of a duty to the collective that's embodied in law, or whether a moral society is one that doesn't let that happen, is a valid, and that's the crux of the libertarian. In other words, however you answer that will tell me whether you're a libertarian or not, because, at least in my theory, it will, because I'm looking to how are the laws going to be shaped with respect to what my obligations are. And so if somebody's going to, I think it's a very deep, it's deeper. In your article, you wrote, I saw politics, as Andrew Breitbart said, is downstream from culture. And then, as you write, and both politics and culture are downstream from ideas. And what I took from that was that implies, one being downstream, that whoever can influence the culture or the ideas, can then influence the politics. So then a libertarian would say, well, listen, if I can just get into the idea realm and have an effect on ideas, then I can have an effect on the politics. And Breitbart says, well, if I can get into the cultural realm and affect culture, I can affect politics. But my reply would be, yes, you can have marginal effect. But I think if you go back and read the founders and the arguments, it seems like there was a 50-50 split, even though they were relatively free by our standards. There was this 50-50 split, as I recall, in history, and it was fiercely fought. There was two sides of the aisle even back then. It wasn't a monolith. Wasn't there the Madisonians and there was two sides, and of course they were more liberty oriented then. And now we come here 200 years later, 250 years, and there's two sides. So what are those two sides that always keep happening? Why is it always two sides? There has to, as I explain it, there doesn't have to be. As I would explain it, there's a very good reason for that. And it goes to me back to some very fundamental parts of human nature, which is that you will only experience your own conscious experiences. So there's the selfishness aspect, because from the consciousness of the individual, everybody else is just a stick figure walking around. You can't feel their pain, notwithstanding what Bill Clinton said. But I can feel my pain. So my experiences are very important to me. And society says, well, Adam, but you're not the only one who's here. There's other people who have experiences. And I say, well, I don't experience those. I'll trust you guys that there are those out there. I don't experience them. So now there's a conflict, because there's the experiences that I feel on the one hand, and there's all my fellow citizens who, as far as I know, have those same ones, but that I don't feel. So which takes priority when we have a conflict between the two? Which one takes priority? And if you tell me how someone decides on that, I'm going to tell you who I can maybe argue and onto my side of being a libertarian, and I'm going to tell you the person who I probably can't, based on how they answered that question that goes way back to their childhood, or even just their most fundamental being. So to me, that's upstream from ideas and culture. I think if you go to every culture, you're going to find people who are one of those, and you're going to find people who are the other of those. And I don't think I'm saying anything controversial, by I follow a guy named Brett Weinstein. I don't know if you know him. He's a biologist, but he has said, and I kind of agree, for example, something like, I think men are more maverick than women, more averse to control, or the more averse to group sublimation. In other words, they chafe at that more, and women are more group oriented. We're talking generalities. We're not every single person. Generalities, okay, people. So don't misinterpret. So I think in society there are people who are more individualistic at the most fundamental level, and then there are people who are more collectivistic, and that those are both valid choices. Valid, when I say valid, doesn't mean I approve of them, but that those are plausible, because you have to decide whether, when the group so if I grow up and I say, the group says to me, Adam, we think you should try to walk 1 foot at a time, 1 foot in front of the other. I go, okay, you guys are right. But so real simple things, I'm in agreement with the group. But what happens when I don't agree with the group? Then who fundamentally should take precedence when my experience contradicts that of what the group is telling me? And I know that I tend to answer it that my conscious experience takes precedence, and that's kind of why I'm a libertarian. But I think other people answer it, say, well, you can't do that. Who are you to assert your single experience? There's thousands of people, there's billions of people, and if they agree otherwise, you need to conform. You need to conform. And that's the fundamental choice. And Ayn Rand used to talk about collectivism. I think she had a very good point about that versus individualism. And I'm not saying I agree with her approach, her philosophical approach, but she kind of honed in on the fundamental distinction that we're facing, I think, today is like we're in a world that where collectivisms run amok, so to speak. And
Well, I think that we're all both collectivist and individualist to some extent. Um, and I think that you're right that people do have certain dispositions, and so that's why there will always be that's one factor that contributes to there always being like two sides throughout history, during every like political era. But when you're talking about the two sides in the revolutionary era, like for example, there were the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and it was actually the Anti-Federalists who were like more libertarian. But you know, the Federalists were also libertarian. So it was like there was like a more libertarian versus like a less libertarian side
but
there.
that's what I was. You know the history better than I do. I was hoping you'd help me out on that. But would you say, is it fair to say that one of the sides was more comfortable with the consolidation or centralization, and one of the sides was less comfortable with that?
Federalists were more.
Yeah, so I'm trying to hone in on that divide. So that divide existed, even though the historical circumstance with which they were placed was a more libertarian one. They were grappling with the same things, because the idea was, next week we have to make some laws or not make them. And they were equally divided on that.
It wasn't just like a historical circumstance like Marxian materialism. Like, it was ideas. Like, it was the ideas of John Locke and other libertarian philosophers that shaped the parameter of the debate, because both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were Lockean Whigs, what we would now call libertarian. So like it's the the predisposition is a factor in terms of how radically they embraced those ideas, but the ideas were still very much upstream. Like it was still the ideas that shaped the parameters of that debate. And so if we could go back to that by doing as good of a job at spreading our ideas as John Locke and the Lockeans were, then things would be much better.
Well, I definitely agree well, I certainly agree that I thought the founding fathers were relatively libertarian, especially compared to today. And I mean, I don't deny that there's a potential pathway towards there there's some potential pathway towards argument affecting us back towards towards a libertarian society. But my point that
Not not
I didn't,
not only arguments changing the policy, but it was arguments changing the morals that changed the policy. Because this was really well documented by C. Bradley Thompson in his book, America's Revolutionary Mind. And his subtitle was, he called it A Moral History of like the revolution, like of the declaration, the revolution and the declaration that inspired it, or something like that. And he made the point that for the founders, like, it was very much a moral cause, and that morality was influenced by a philosophy. And so again, I just I don't think it I don't think it makes sense to omit either the ideas and the philosophy, the intellectual existential propositions, or the morals from it, because I think that's generally how social change happens.
okay. What I was trying to say was that even granted that, let's say, Lockean philosophy influenced all of the founding fathers, and led to the relative freedom they had, compared to which we envy as libertarians envy that. So there's no disagreement there. But there came a point where they found themselves in the present with a common history that you've described of philosophical and moral history. And they came to a point where in their own history, where they had to make a decision about the future that entailed an action. And those two groups were roughly equally divided about whether the next action should be a consolidated or a centralization movement, or whether it would be whether it would be the other direction. And so all I'm saying is that it interests me that no matter, I feel that no matter what period of history you put someone in, they're going to have to face that choice, and they're going to start working towards either centralizing, or they're going to be resisting that. They're going to play one of those two roles. And so we're in a position now where we're way past, obviously, the freedoms they had. But even then, they had to decide whether to centralize or to resist centralization. And we're no different. We have to make the same decision, except we're historically placed in a you and I are historically placed now. Unfortunately for us, history's not with us. We weren't granted this amazing Lockean moral setting and 50 years of moral history and liberty history. We're now well beyond that, but we had to make the same choice, because tomorrow, on next Monday, I have a feeling there's going to be more centralization and consolidation. I don't think there's going to be a lot of liberalization next Monday. So again, it just brings us back to, it's the same fundamental divide. So what were the arguments that were advanced in favor of centralization back then? I assume that was some very important social issues that required it.
Well,
what we talked.
It was
Go
the
ahead.
Federalist Papers, which were also very libertarian. So, like, the Federalists, the reason why they wanted to centralize under like a federal government, what was for liberty. Like, they thought that a federal government would secure liberty better than the government under the Articles of Confederation would. So that's just worth noting, that even though the Federalists were more centralizers, it wasn't necessarily because that they were like less libertarian. Like they just, I mean, except I do think that it's inherently less libertarian to centralize government, but they didn't think that, and the reason why they wanted to centralize government was for the sake of liberty. So it 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 wasn't like so much. It wasn't like classical liberals versus Tories kind of conflict. Um, but also to what you said about like Monday and like the context that we're in. Like Leonard Reed talks about this in terms of like objections to sort of like the educational route to like, we like it's too slow, or we don't have enough time, or and Leonard Reed's answer was like, it takes as long as it takes. Like, and it's no matter how much you would wish it was otherwise, that like it doesn't make sense to, you know, bemoan the fact that, flowers aren't growing where no seeds were strewn. Well, like that bemoaning isn't going to make the flowers grow any faster, and there's no other way. Like there's no shortcut. You've got to plant the seeds. And so that's the way I think about it now, is that we're not going to get any libertarian government by Monday. Like we might not get it in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
But the fastest way to get it, I think, or like it is, however fast that is to just speak the truth, and to, to learn the truth, and to share it as best we can, so that people's ideas change, and so that their morals change, so that, whether it's in this generation or several generations hence, that someone will find themselves in a situation that's more like the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, and less like today's Democrats versus Republicans.
Mm-hmm. Well, fair. That's fair. I mean, I think to me, I feel that that's an argument, or a thesis, let's say, that that a good strategy for achieving a more libertarian world is to transmit ideas, and that to our fellow human beings, such that they themselves will either embody or will want that future that we are desirous of, so that they too will either want that or just become that. In other words, if I am successful in through example or through persuasion, influencing or affecting my fellow citizens, my colleagues or family members, that they either will change, or will some change will be affected in them that will either lead to or will allow a freer society. And the fact that that hasn't happened yet, and the fact that I think by objective measures in the last, I like to use the year 1950 just as a modern libertarianism's beginning, let's say, back to Rand, Rothbard, Mises, whoever, and Leonard Reed. The fact that society's been going kind of in the opposite direction then implies that we haven't exemplified or explained libertarian philosophy well enough. So we have to improve in our internal effectiveness. Each individual libertarian needs to improve their internal effectiveness toward the end of influencing the people that we come into contact with or that we reach through electronic means, so that they say, hey, these two guys seem to be making a lot of sense, and they seem to be happy, relatively adjusted people, and I'm going to give them an ear and maybe open my mind to their ideas that they're expressing. I mean,
Exactly.
right? Okay, so it's a plausible, as I just said it. It's a plausible pathway towards a freer society.
Yeah, the way Leonard Reed put it in the Kakistocracy articles that I wrote about is that the antidote to Kakistocracy is aristocracy. Now, not the government privilege aristocracy by force, but what Thomas Jefferson called a natural aristocracy, which is leadership by virtue, basically. I mean, that's what aristocracy means. Is like leadership or rule or government by excellence or virtue, and so that just literally is the antithesis of kakistocracy, because you could think of government by the worst as government by the most vicious, the most vice ridden, as opposed to virtue ridden, and but in order to avoid trying to make excellent people, virtuous people, become government privileged and then become degraded by that privilege and lose all their virtue because power corrupts, that aristocrats lead by example. And in order to lead by example, you have to cultivate virtue in yourself. And so, and the virtues of a thought leader, Leonard Reed said, is threefold. That there's the understanding of the ideas that you're espousing, like fully understanding it. There's the dedication to those ideas, like how well you uphold them. And there's the attractive exposition of those ideas, which is based on understanding, because you can't, like Leonard Reed said, you can't share what you don't have. And an attractive exposition generally is like what I called before, learning out loud. That when you're expositing in order to better understand, then that kind of exposition just elicits trust and helps you understand things better, and is often just more palatable, more accessible, more understandable to other people. So Leonard Reed has a whole book called the Coming Aristocracy, just making the case that what we need are like a new founding generation, that we need leaders that were on par with people like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, for all of his moral failings, but in terms of the virtues that they had, that caliber of moral authority and moral leadership, and leadership by excellence, and understanding the ideas, and sharing them through pamphlets and articles and things like the Federalist Papers, and that that's the antidote to kakistocracy, is cultivating excellence within. And again, I'm not saying that this is to the exclusion of things like, panarchy or panarchic agreements or any kinds of ways of working around tyranny. I think that those are very complementary, because the more there is an understanding and a shift in morality, and a shift in ideology, that then the more people will want to engage in those kinds of agreements. Um, and the causation goes in the other way around too, because the more that people engage in those kinds of agreements and show the effectiveness of liberty, and show how people who achieve liberty in these alternate ways, how they thrive, that's going to be a powerful testimony in praxis of these ideas, and will make people more open to the ideas, and more like embracing of the ideas as well.
Well, touching on some things you were just saying, I did highlight um, when the meddlers run amok from a passage in your article. It says, a message of self-improvement and personal responsibility can succeed where socioeconomic arguments fail, because it's less of an intellectual exercise and more of a practical dilemma. And, this is getting back to the idea of libertarian self-improvement individually, and I guess I would argue as a class too. But what I had written, my note was, what kind of struck me is that if you think about, because we're people who, I think you'll agree with this, we don't just think, but we act, and that's every day. In other words, we have both. We have our thoughts and our actions, and the actions doesn't have to be something physical with our arms or our legs. It can be deciding who to socialize with, or deciding how to approach different problems. Well, that's thinking, I guess so. But we discussing things with people, or let's say going to vote. And so what I think I'm trying to say in as a complement to what Reed was proposing, because it strikes me that this is a vision, what he's saying is a vision of self, let's call it internal improvement. And what I'm trying to say is that, what about the idea of our improvement in our exterior conduct? And I'll give you some examples. For example, if libertarians say, well, we want a more free society, so we're going to protest. So that's one form of action. Or the second form would be, well, we're going to vote. We're going to try to move to New Hampshire and vote for liberty, or we're going to try to vote for liberty. Or we're going to go out on the discussion boards and argue and try to confront every non-libertarian and try and get them to change their minds. Or we're going to, so there's action options. So my question for a future that we could maybe do in the future would be, why can't the self-improvement that we libertarians have include the improvement in our action plan as a complement to our spiritual or moral improvement? Why can't we, because our action plan clearly in my mind is not working. So I would see that our action plan would embody our spiritual values. And what is a libertarian's primary spiritual value or moral value? It is the aversion to using physical force or aggression or coercion in human relationships to the greatest extent possible, so that our action plan would somehow embody our spiritual improvement or spiritual values. And so so therefore, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I could say my argument is a complement, I would say, to Reed's. It does, as you were saying, mine doesn't preclude someone from morally improving or spiritually improving. Um, but in transparency, I guess I've been focusing more on the action improvement, seeing how I think our libertarians' action philosophy or plans have failed. So I don't. I think we could agree that we want libertarians to improve morally. Not and for example, we agree we don't think libertarians should be demonizing non-libertarians. So there's that's low-hanging fruit. Just stop the name calling. Stop looking for evil people. Stop looking for enemies. Stop looking for the people who need to be in jail. I mean, I know there are people who need to be in jail, but we have better things to pursue, which is our own freedom, which is
Yeah,
more important than who we imprison.
to that point, that's another thing that I discuss in my Kakistocracy article, is that the more we fixate on personalities as the enemies, and the more that we identify our cause as being against those enemies, those as opposed to being like against certain ideas or for certain ideas, then the more that we are liable to actually abandon our principles. Because if the ultimate objective is to be like for certain personalities, like being for Trump or being against certain past personalities, like being against Biden or against Fauci, then the more that we're going to like abandon the whole point of what we're trying to do, and try to use like non-libertarian means to, to just attack
I'm
those
going to
people.
coerce
Or
you into stop coercing me,
exactly,
or I'm going to be
exactly.
so hostile to you that you will never be hostile to me again. I mean, it's clear if you think about it, it's almost laughable that you basically what you're doing is you're exemplifying the values you're claiming to be against. And so you're defeating yourself, you're self-defeating. So what I would suggest is that we exemplify the value that we're trying to advertise or promulgate, so that our political plan would be to show how voluntary relationships work by exemplifying those amongst ourselves and showing the benefit of that to any interested observer, and how that could be accomplished. Again, we can talk about that later. I do have two more quick highlights that I did real quick. As Reed stressed, we should avoid imposing our explanations on those who have no interest in them. So again, to me, that's an action strategy, and I agree with that action strategy. So don't impose your libertarian, if I may, religion on other people. And I really don't do that, because I actually don't know if I want everybody to become a libertarian. I just want myself and you and whoever else wants to be free to have freedom. If somebody says, I don't want any piece of that, it's like, well, I'm going to go do it here. Watch me. And if maybe you'll see something you like, or maybe I'll be wrong. I'll have to come back to you and say, I actually like your system better, So the paradox of changing the world is that the best way to improve others is to not try to improve others. It's a great insight. Sometimes the best way to control something is to let go. And that's totally counterintuitive, but that involves faith, confidence, self-confidence, faith in humanity, a disposition that believes good things are going to happen. So sometimes the best way is to not force things, is to let things be and to relinquish control, to have things go the way you want them to go. And no, not enough people believe that. But maybe we can show them how that works somehow.
Yeah. Here's
So
hoping.
I have faith that we can do that.
Me too.
So, well, I've reached the end of my highlights and my furiously written notes. So I don't know if you have any other topics you want to cover while we're here on these topics.
No, I think we've got a good 90 minutes or so in there. So, or much long, actually more than that. Um, so yeah, I think there's a good natural stopping point. So thank you, Adam.
Yeah, and I think if there's ever something we don't talk about that you meant to, and you go back and say, I really want to do talk about this one thing, we can always put that back in on your next. Say, well, before we go on, I want to say there's this one thing I really want to say last time I didn't get to say it, because I find myself having that using the last talk to say, oh, I want to say, make sure I talk about this next time.
Yeah.
So we can always bring things back in. We don't have to bury these for in history. We can bring back parts and stuff, right?
Yeah, and I will say something that is very that just comes from my heart about what you were quoting about like not imposing your libertarian message on people. I mean, it's very similar to the gospel for me, and in the Bible, that it's very much reminiscent of cast not your pearls before swine. And that's not even like making a value judgment of just like, oh well, these people are pigs or anything. The point is that like pigs don't appreciate pearls, and maybe there's some people who hate pearls and they don't appreciate pearls either. And so it doesn't make sense to cast things that aren't valued before people, because like Leonard Reed said, that everyone controls controls access to the lock of their mind, and everyone controls admission to their mind. And so if you're not if a person does not regard what you're saying as pearls of wisdom, then no amount of like hectoring them about it is going to help. If they're not at a point in their intellectual journey where they're ready to hear what you have to say, chances are, there might be situations where like there's just like a few more additional steps where they could get to that point where they can understand what you're trying to say. But odds are there might be like a whole range of experiences and things that they need to read and things that they need to consider before they're at a point where what you have to offer is what they're ready to hear. And so I think that's really just a wise practice of really just consider, like Leonard Reed the way he put it is that when he flew a lot on planes, and when he would sit next to people, and like he would just kind of they would just naturally chit chat, just kind of like small talk, and eventually, because of the nature of his job, just from the conversation and from like what he was talking about, what he was doing, the other person will eventually get to a point who would say like, what is it that you do? Like, what is your job? Like, and then he would tell them what his job was. And then he said that the way that they responded to him telling that, he could tell automatically whether it was worth continuing with them or not. Like he could tell whether they were like, oh, interesting. Tell me more. Like if they were receptive to that whole idea, or if they were like, put up a wall against it. And, if it was the latter, he would just leave them alone. But if it was the former, he said that it was like almost certain that by the end of the flight that they would be a libertarian because he was that good at explaining these things to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I like, and he, in his writings, he's exemplifying and like I said last time, walking the walk. In other words, I'm not going to exemplify hostility and combativeness and coercion, even just if it's subtle mental coercion or argumentative coercion, if what I'm seeking is a world that has less of those things. So, I find myself in an agreement with a lot of what I'm learning that Reed wrote and stood for. So I think we should continue to expound these ideas and explore them, and if possible, find out. I'm sure I'll have some little disagreements here and there that we can also discuss.
Sounds great, Adam. Thanks again.
It's great, Dan. Thank you.